The future of AI is undoubtedly intertwined with agentic workflows, or agents, basically encapsulated AIs that talk to each other to collectively accomplish tasks that otherwise a single large language model maybe wouldn't be able to. This applies to any number of industries, not only just programming and things like math or reasoning, but to any task that you might want to automate with a large language model. And what's insane about our current reality is that there's already been tooling released for this for the better part of a year. So gone are the days when you actually just had to write a bunch of scripts that would each on their own call the ChatGPT 4 API and talk to each other. Now you can actually use tooling, in this case open source tooling, to do a lot of this and actually run it in production. So whether or not you're trying to automate a call center or replace the interns you hired who actually weren't as smart as you thought, agents are really something we can use right now, and you can hook them up to any number of models. And accelerators like Grok have actually made this pretty affordable. But the question is, what platforms do you use? And what I'd like to cover today is a really exciting release from OpenAI that was soured when it turns out that all of the naming and even classes and a lot of the code appear to have been nearly copied directly from an existing open source project that also bears the same name. So did OpenAI actually steal this from a startup? Is this just another instance of a huge company completely ignoring the rules of open source and taking credit for someone else's work? Welcome to AI Flux. Let's get into it. So first, I want to briefly go over this OpenAI release. So OpenAI released a tool called Swarm for agentic workflows, specifically with OpenAI APIs. There are bumblebees all over it, and they're very open, calling this an experimental and educational project. So when you see this in a Git repo, basically means don't use it for anything production level, but definitely mess around with it because it might be a direction we want to take in the future. And they even give you a warning here. So they say Swarm is an experimental sample framework intended to explore ergonomic interfaces for multi-agent systems. It is not intended to be used in production and therefore has no official support, which also means that they're not going to respond to any of your PRs or anything like that. The primary goal of Swarm is to showcase the handoff and routine patterns explored in their paper on agentic workflows, kind of the cookbook of how you use OpenAI's GPT-4 for agentic things. And the idea here is you can just do a pip install and you have this platform ready to go. And they have some examples here of how you can use this. Now, what's weird is I've actually been following and actually using a framework called Swarms that has been open source and fully available for the better part of a year. And I actually know some people who are using this in production. So what's curious is OpenAI used the same name, it's just not plural. And then earlier this week, Kyle Gomez, who created this project and now runs a startup that focuses on developing around this whole platform, found some really interesting overlaps and at one point seemed to be coincidental similarities that raised a lot of questions. And the most important thing here is that Swarms is an enterprise-grade platform that is completely open source. So this isn't something that is meant to be necessarily licensed in the same way that an OpenAI product would be. And the big key here is it's enterprise grade and production ready for multi-agent collaboration, basically enabling you to orchestrate a bunch of agents together. And the funny thing is even the verbiage in the intro is pretty similar, which is a little bit weird. So what was the similarity here? Obviously, they're literally named the same. They basically do the same thing, and one that is open source is much better. Let's get into that. So Kyle really leaned in here. And one thing that's a little frustrating is that when OpenAI released what is pretty much machine-generated low-quality code for a framework that, yes, works, but does basically the same thing again as Swarms, is that they got 4,000 stars on GitHub in 2 days, which means that with this Swarm name, they garnered quite a bit of attention and kind of piggybacked on the idea that, oh yeah, like we were the first to do this and actually release this in something that you could use that's open source. So the idea that OpenAI is open at all is, kind of hilarious on its face. But here's what Kyle had to say. So he said OpenAI's low-quality clone of Swarms got 4,000 stars in 2 days, with them saying it's not meant to be used in production and anything else not related to experimentation. The code is not carefully crafted, which I can also attest to, and it looks like they had LLMs write the code. They have some type validation, but they don't have the doc strings, they don't have any logging, and people in a random Discord could come up with a better agent framework. So basically, this just means it was put together in a sloppy way, and that if you're going to use it, the developer experience is probably not very good. This is why it's important to show your report for the official Swarms Corp repo, which I have done. It'll be linked below in the description. And please follow them on Twitter so you can follow their development releases. They are actually already doing a mixture of agents on Swarms, which is pretty crazy. So every class, every function has type validation in the official Swarms repo, and it has logging. So basically means if you want to mess around with this and use it, it will actually be useful and you won't be doing a lot of work that someone at OpenAI should have done before they released this Swarm repo. With Kyle's biggest point being that OpenAI claiming any of this as reliable is kind of a complete joke. And it's important to note that Kyle's Swarms was the first ever production grade multi agent orchestration framework. I was using it over 6 months ago. And the idea that OpenAI just randomly picked this name is kind of hilarious because of all the names. Like you think that they would Google Swarms AI agents and that this didn't show up, which is ridiculous. So OpenAI, I would say yes, they stole the name. That yes, they didn't copy the code, but there are very clear, kind of stunning similarities between the way that Swarms is set up and the way that OpenAI's Swarm is set up. And of course, you could argue that yes, like the methodology of using agents is inherently going to be kind of similar, but I would say that there's more than just kind of a passing similarity here. And the biggest point of this evidence was the swarm class object, which is a data structure used that's integral to how like this entire thing uses, was clearly taken from swarms. Like it is nearly identical. So the idea that this is just a hallucination that maybe something was trained on at OpenAI is also kind of hilarious. So Kyle at this point is looking, at least in some way, to retain some kind of legal help here to understand what damages have been done against their brand and their name. I'm not sure if they have a trademark, but it would be really interesting to see what kind of develops here. Their website is swarms.ai. And yeah, I would say if you look up Swarms AI and OpenAI's repo comes up, just know that that is not necessarily what you should be using at all. I actually tried using OpenAI's framework for this, and like Kyle said, there's no logging, so you just kind of have to hope everything is working. And as far as the developer experience is concerned, it was kind of a joke. So clearly an experimental thing, but you have to wonder why they would have released that if not just to garner attention and kind of absorb the Swarms brand on top of the rest of the tooling that OpenAI has. Because I think a criticism that OpenAI is trying to combat recently is that they see themselves as kind of better than the rest of anyone doing AI development, and that they're focused on sort of closed source research and not necessarily sharing very much with their developer base because they know that, oh, we have the biggest market share, so why would we bother? Which for some people, like if you're a VC, might make sense as a strategy. But in terms of going forward, even for closed source companies, even for companies who work in kind of a dark closet, developing sort of closed source tools that are then released in an open source manner. What's interesting is, Meta again paved the way for the notion of yes, using closed source, of having kind of a black box methodology when you're creating frontier models, and then being able to reap the benefits of an open source side of things once you release it to people generally. And we've never really been able to understand what OpenAI's position here is, because obviously they're not open sourcing any of their models. Yes, they have impressive tooling around certain areas, but they are not necessarily paving the way forward in terms of supporting people who want to use this outside of just an API or who want to use this in agentic workflows. And I think a really interesting point of argument here is the reason OpenAI doesn't want to do this is their strategy largely is that they hope they see someone doing something interesting that might be profitable. And then their whole product cycle is how do we internalize that and turn that into something that we can capture like 70% of instead of actually empowering someone else to still like purchase our API and purchase our services, but not necessarily capture everything. Like they have kind of this idea that we should capture everything and monetize as much as possible, as opposed to enabling, and then as a result of enabling more people, capture market share that way. And I think it is a hostile thing for not only just the future of AI and large language models, but for the community of developers who work with this technology. There's a running joke that you have to be careful building on OpenAI or building with OpenAI tools, especially wrapper-based things, because if you're not careful, in like 4 to 6 months, it's likely whatever you're building, if it saw any amount of success, will just be created internally at OpenAI and then sold or given away basically for free for anyone who pays $30 a month to use ChatGPT. And the troubling angle of this, and fortunately, SB 1047 didn't pass in California, which was one of the first big serious AI regulation bills. But OpenAI takes the same set of plays and the same set of strategies to regulatory frameworks. And obviously, people aren't coming here to watch this video to hear me talk about how exciting regulatory frameworks are, but regulatory frameworks are starting to actually dictate what we as people who use open source AI and who want to use local AI can do and are even allowed to do. And I think that's a little bit ridiculous because, Meta has shown that the biggest gains you get are from people outside of Meta, like engineers who aren't at Meta using it, and then showing them what you can do. Obviously, they make huge contributions with the foundation models and sort of structuring these things so they're usable. But yeah, so it's interesting. So I believe that, yes, OpenAI pretty blatantly stole this project, or at least stole the naming. They liked the name enough that they said, look, why don't we just put out like a fluffy repo that basically works but isn't very useful? And then we won't support it, so people, generally speaking, won't use it. And we'll kind of piggyback on a lot of the buzz and the hard work of this kind of smaller startup. And then we'll just pretend like it didn't happen and move on. And I hope that Swarms and Kyle are able to kind of claw back something from this, and that this doesn't just become another of kind of the far too many stories of Silicon Valley of big companies deciding to not buy companies and just kind of dog food or completely capture and take credit for work that wasn't necessarily theirs, just because it's kind of the next big thing, which in this case is agentic AI flows. So I'm curious, do you guys use agents? Have you tried messing around with them locally? Do you prefer just to do coding with singular agents, like by using Cursor or using Cloud Sonnet? Let me know in the comments below. It's always really interesting to hear. Also look below for a link to a new project I'm working on called LLMbuilds.ai. It's a place where I can put a lot of information about local AI builds, which is something that I know you guys like to watch videos about. So check that out. And yeah, as always, I hope you learned something from this video. If you like our content, please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you in the next one.